Japan's seismic intensity scale ends at 7. There is no 8. It simply stops because the engineers who built the scale ran out of language to describe what comes next. Yesterday afternoon, 2 municipalities in Kumamoto Prefecture hit that ceiling at exactly the same moment. The ground moved so violently that furniture was not sliding. It was airborne. People could not stand, could not crawl, could not orient themselves. And then the ceiling of an Aeon shopping mall came down with people inside it. A gas explosion tore through the structure, and Japan's prime minister stood in front of cameras and told the survivors of the hardest hit areas to pray for it to happen again. That is where we begin. Not with the collapse, not with the fires, not with the derailed bullet train NS or the factories that went dark across Kyushu. We begin with the reason Japan's own head of government, leading a country with arguably the most sophisticated earthquake response infrastructure on Earth, could not tell her citizens the danger was over. On July 28, 2026, at 1627 local time, an earthquake struck Kumamoto Prefecture in southern Japan, with a magnitude of 7.1 by Japan Meteorological Agency standards and 6.8 by the United States Geological Survey, at a preliminary depth of 10 kilometers. That DPTH number is the first thing to understand about this event, because it is the reason a seismic reading that would be serious and anywhere on the planet became catastrophic here. 10 kilometers is shallow. When a fault breaks that close to the surface, the inner guy has almost no distance to travel before it reaches the roads, the buildings, the retaining walls, and the people standing on to pee of them. The rock column between the rupture and the surface is barely thicker than the altitude of a commercial aircraft cruising G above it. And that proximity is what separates a damaging earthquake from one that produces the highest intensity reading Japan S instruments can express. Wide areas of Kumamoto registered a maximum seismic intensity of 7, with strong shaking felt across Miyazaki, Kagoshima, Nagasaki, Saga, and Fukuoka, and experts are cautioning that further strong earthquakes could follow. Shindo says is not just a number at the top of a chart. It is the point at which the Japan Meteorological Agency's own descriptive language, shifts from damage to outright structural failure. At Shindo 7, reinforced buildings, structures built to Japanese seismic code, WH-IC is among the strictest on the planet, can suffer severe damage or visibly lean. Unreinforced structures fail outright. He 2 municipalities that recorded that maximum reading yesterday were Uki City and Heikawa Town, sitting directly above the Feiyu LT line that drove this event. The rupture occurred along the 81-kilometer Hinagu Fault and the 64-kilometer Futagawa Fault to its north, with measurable interaction extending to the Beppu Hanayama Fault Zone. A 27-kilometer section of the Futagawa Fault slid approximately 3.5 meters. That is not a tremor. That is a tectonic event that physically relocated a section of crust by the length h of 3 double-decker buses in the seconds it took to rupture. And it is the identity of those specific fault structures that explains everything about why Japan's prime minister said what she said, and why no seismologist alive can tell her she was wrong. Well, the earthquake sparked fires in Kumamoto City, trapped shoppers inside a partially collapsed shopping mall, cut power to thousands of homes, and left roads badly damaged. The Aeon Mall in Kashima partially collapsed from an explosion that occurred roughly an hour after the earthquake hit, with a suspected gas leak cited as the cause. Customers had been evacuated from the complex before the blast, but mall staff remained inside. 5 people were confirmed dead inside the mall, with a further 3 missing. 5 additional deaths were reported at a paper factory. Search and rescue operations were still running through the night. By the morning of July the 29th, approximately 260,000 people had been advised to evacuate as aftershocks continued across Kyushu, with authorities also warning of the risk of landslides and heat stroke, as temperatures in the region were expected to reach 34 degrees Celsius. Japan's Nuclear Regulation Authority confirmed that no abnormalities had been detected at 3 nearby nuclear Pyongyang power plants. Several major manufacturers, including Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, Sony, and Fujifilm, evacuated workers from regional facilities and halted operations pending damage assessments. But the damage count is not the story that has scientists alarmed this morning. The buildings that fell, the fires that burned, the infrastructure that fractured, those are the consequences of a fault rupture that is already finished. What the seismological community is still watching, still calculating, till losing sleep over, is something that has not happened yet. It may never happen, but it cannot be ruled out. And the reason IT cannot be ruled out is written directly into the geological record of the ground beneath Kumamoto. Because this fault system, HHR, has done something on this exact terrain before, and the world was not watching closely enough when it started. There is a concept T in seismology that sounds simple until you try to apply it in real time, and then it becomes one of the most uncomfortable fact T's in all of earth science. A foreshock is not a thing that exists at the moment it happens. It becomes a foreshock only after RD, only when something larger follows it. Until that moment arrives, every earthquake on the planet is provisionally a main shock K. The scientists watching Kumamoto right now cannot tell you which category yesterday's rupture belongs to. Not because their IE instruments are inadequate, not because their models are outdated, but because the physics of fault rupture makes that distinction impossible to draw before the sequence finishes writing itself. To understand why that matters so urgently for Kumamoto specifically, you have to go back exactly 10 years to the same prefecture, the same fault system, and a sequence of events that permanently changed the way Japan communicates with its own citizens after a large earthquake. On the 14th of April 2016, a magnitude 6.5 earthquake struck Kumamoto Prefecture along the northern part of the Hinagu Fault in central Kyushu. It hit at Shindo 7. People died. Buildings collapsed. Emergency teams deployed. And the working assumption across Japan was the one any rational observer would make: that was the earthquake. Now comes the response. Now comes the recovery. 28 hours later, the same fault system M produced a magnitude 7.3 main shock. The rupture began deep on the Hinagu Fault, then transferred to the Futagawa Fault, with the largest slip occurring on the Futagawa segment. That second event was far more destructive than the first, in part because it arrived on structures the first earthquake had already cracked and weakened, which is precisely the mechanism that makes a large FO. Tershock inside a damaged zone so dangerous. It does not need to match the original event in energy. It only needs to be strong E enough to finish what the first one started. It was the first time in recorded Japanese history that a seismic intensity of 7 was registered twice within 2 days in the same sequence. The complexity of that activity was unexpected, even unknown active fault, where long-term probabilities had been publicly disseminated. Afterward, the catalog was rewritten. The 6.5 was reclassified. It had never been the main shock. It had been the opening move, and the country had spent 28 hours believing the wrong Dainankaneng. Yesterday's rupture occurred along the same Hinagu and Futagawa fault structures that produced the 2016 sequence. This is not a coincidence of geography. This is the same machine activating again. And so when Japan's Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi stood before cameras and instructed Kumamoto residents to prepare for another earthquake of similar scale, she was not speculating. She was not being alarmist. She was applying institutional memory written in blood on that specific ground, encoded into national emerge, NCI policy, and applied to the identical fault system that produced the lesson. And here is where the science becomes both more precise and more honest about its own limits. Seismologists use an empirical relationship called Bath's law to estimate the expected size of the largest aftershock in a sequence. The relationship holds that the largest aftershock typically arrives at roughly I 1.1 to 1.2 magnitude units below the main shock. Apply that to a magnitude 7.1, and the statistical expectation falls around magnitude 5.9 to 6.0. That number carries two important qualifications. First, it is a central tendency, not a ceiling. Real sequences exceed it regularly. Second, and this is the detail that changes the character of the next 48 hours, a magnitude 6. 0 does not need to match a 7.1 to be devastating. On structures already compromised, on retaining walls already shifted, on hills IDs already destabilized, a magnitude 6.0 can accomplish what the first event left unfinished. The second hit only needs to arrive. It does not need to be equal. The rate at which aftershocks arrive follows a separate empirical relationship known as Omori law. The sequence decays roughly as the inverse of time elapsed since the main shock. Most of the events in any sequence happen early. The tail runs long but thin. What seismologists watch for is a stall, a sequence where the decay rate stops following the expected curve. That anomaly, if it appears, is a signal that stress redistribution is still active on the fault system, and indeed it changes the probability calculus significantly. The Japan Meteorological Agency has confirmed that continuous tremors and aftershocks are ongoing in Kumamoto, and experts are cautioning that further strong earthquakes could follow. The JMA's standing institutional guidance after any large, shallow crustal earthquake is that a comparable event can follow within 1 to 2 weeks. That window is not a forecast. It is a statement about elevated probability relative to background rates, and it decays with time. As of this morning, Kumamoto is roughly 1 day into IT. The global base rate gives some statistical comfort and then immediately complicates it. Approximately 5 to 6% of moderate to large earthquakes worldwide are followed by something larger within 3 days. Flip that number around, and it means roughly 19 out of every 20 are followed by nothing bigger. The probability favors yesterday being the main shock. Buti probably is carrying an enormous amount of weight in that sentence. And in April 2016, Kumamoto was the 1 in 20. Japan sits on the Ring of Fire and accounts for approximately 20% of the world's earthquakes of magnitude 6.0 or greater. The nation has engineered its buildings, its emergency protocols, and its public communication systems around that reality for generate ions. But no amount of engineering changes the underlying limit the science itself imposes. And that limit is not a gap that beat outer sensors will close. It is structural. A rupture that terminates at magnitude 6.5 and a rupture that continues to magnitude 7.3 begin in precisely the same way. The difference emerges during the rupture, not before it. There is no advanced signature to detect. There is nothing yet to distinguish at the moment of initiation. What that means for every seismologist monitoring Kyushu this morning is that they are watching the aftershock map accumulate. Not because the map will give them a warning before a layer GIR event, but because it will tell them, in real time, whether stress is staying compact around yesterday's rupture or begin in GI to migrate along the fault system in a direction that would matter enormously. 3 things will tell the scientific community we hear the sequence is going. Not press releases, not official statements. 3 specific signals in the data that seismologists are watching in real time, and each one carries a different kind of weight. The first is the spatial distribution of aftershocks. A magnitude 4.1 aftershock struck Kumamoto Prefecture just after midnight on Wednesday, with its epicenter near the coastal city of Uto, approximately 48 kilometers southwest of Kumamoto City. That location matters. If aftershocks continue clustering tightly around the original rupture zone near Uki City, the sequence is behaving the way a normal decaying sequence behaves. Stress R releasing locally, energy dissipating, the fault settling into a long, quiet tail. That is the good outcome, and statistically, it remains the most likely one. But if the aftershock pattern begins elongating, if events start forming a line extending north or southwest along the fault system, seismologists will start asking whether stress is being transferred to an adjacent segment that has not yet broken. And there's already a directional signal worth watching. The Hinagu Fault trends roughly northeast, TO southwest through central Kyushu. The earthquakes in this sequence are occurring along the Beppu Shimabara Graben with epicenters, as showing movement from west to east over time. That migration pattern is not random. It follows the structural grain of the Fei-ULT system. And it is the first thing every analyst tracking this sequence is plotting this morning. The second signal is magnitude. Bath's law gives an expected ceiling around 5.9 to 6.0 for the largest aftershock. If the sequence produces something above that expectation, and particularly if it does so within the 28-hour window that 2016 established as the critical interval, the tone of official messaging in Japan will change visibly and rapidly. There is nothing physically special about 28 hours. It is not a seismological threshold, but it is the number encoded into Japanese institutional memory from the 2016 sequence, and every emergency planner in Kyushu has it in mind right now. Passing that mark without it, a larger event will not end the elevated alert period. The JMA's 1 to 2 week window continues regardless, but it will change the character of the public communication, and it will change the calculus for the hundreds of thousands of people currently displaced. The third signal is the nuclear infrastructure assessment. Japan's Nuclear Regulation Authority confirmed that no abnormalities were found at 3 nearby nuclear power plants following the initial earthquake. But first-pass checks are not finished. Structural inspections. They are initial assessments conducted under emergency conditions, often before aftershocks have fully expressed the stress the main shock redistributed through the surrounding crust. In 2016, operational assessments at regional facilities were revised as the sequence continued. The Sendai nuclear power plant sits approximately 130 kilometers south of yesterday's epicenter. The Genkai plant sits further north on the Saga Prefecture coast. Both passed initial review. Whether those assessments hold through a complete inspection cycle, one conducted after the aftershock sequence has had time to develop, is a different and still open question. And then there is the industrial exposure, which is a story that extends well beyond Kyushu's boards. Ours Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company, Sony, and Fujifilm all evacuated workers from regional facilities and suspended operations pending damage assessments. TSMC's Kumamoto presence is not incidental. The company opened its first Japanese fabricati on facility in the region as part of a broader strategic push to diversify semiconductor production away from Taiwan, a facility that represents billions in investment and sits at the center of a supply chain that feeds into consumer electronics, automotive manufacturing, and defense technology globally. Sony's image sensor operations in Kyushu are similarly critical, supplying components to virtually every major smartphone manufacturer on Earth. A prolonged operational shutdown at either facility caused no T by the main shock itself, but by aftershock damage, infrastructure disruption, or precautionary evacuation, would register in global supply chains within weeks. The earthquake that hits a semiconductor facility does not stay local. It travels through every device that facility was scheduled to supply. Several major manufacturers temporarily halted operations across the region. The full assessment of structural and equipment damage at those facilities will take days, and the timeline for resuming production remains unclear as of this reporting. What is clear is that the economic exposure here extends far beyond collapsed buildings and damaged roads. Kyushu has become one of the most strategically significant manufacturing zones in the Asia-Pacific region over the past 5 years, and yesterday's rupture landed directly inside it. But there is a deeper context sitting beneath all of this, one that the Japanese scientific community has been watching with growing concern for years, and that yesterday's event has pushed back to the front of every seismic risk conversation in the country. Japan has been experiencing an elevated period of seismic AC, activity across multiple fault systems. A magnitude 7.7 earthquake off the Senriku coast of northern Honshu on April 20th of this year prompted the Japan Meteorological Agency to warn of a greater risk of a large earthquake occurring over the following week, issuing elevated alerts to 182 municipalities, primarily along the Pacific coast from Hokkaido to Chiba. A similar advisory had been ISS, UD following a magnitude 7.5 earthquake off Japan's northeastern coast in December 2025. 3 significant seismic events across different Japanese fault systems in under 8 months, each one on a different structural setting, each one generating its own elevated alert window. And now, a shallow crustal rupture on the Futagawa-Hinagu system in Kyushu, a fault type that operates on completely different mechanics from the subduction zone events off the Pacific coast, but that lands in a country already running G-elevated seismic anxiety across its entire emergency management apparatus. The Nankai Trough sits to the southeast of Kyushu. It is a subduction zone where the Philippine Sea Plate dives beneath the Eurasian Plate, and it is the source of Japan's most feared long-term seismic scenario. A magnitude 8 to 9 rupture with the potential to generate a catastrophic tsunami affecting the entire Pacific coast of the country. Japanese government models estimate a 75 to 80% probability of a major Nankai Trough event within the next 30 years. Yesterday's Kumamoto earthquake did not occur on the Nankai Trough. It occurred on a separate inland crustal fault system. But it occurred in a region of Kyushu. The T sits in the broader tectonic neighborhood of that subduction zone, and it has reignited public and scientific discussion about the degree to which stress changes in one part of that regional system can influence another. The honest scientific answer to that question is measured and careful. Dynamic triggering between fault systems at these distances and these magnitudes is a short-range effect. The stress change from a magnitude 7.1 crustal earthquake falls off steeply within tens of kilometers, not hundreds. There is no established physical mechanism by which yesterday's rupture directly loaded the Nankai Trough interface. But the conversation is happening anyway, because in Japan, the Nankai Trough is never far from any seismic discussion, and because the country is currently managing elevated alert windows on multiple systems simultaneously. Here is what the next 48 hours actually look like for the people of Kumamoto, not in terms of headlines, but in terms of the specific measurements and threshold is that will determine how this sequence resolves. The aftershock map is the primary diagnostic. It is already being populated in real time by the dense network of seismic instruments Japan maintains across Kyushu, a network that is among the most sensitive. Stored stress locally. The sequence is decaying on schedule. That is the outcome the data currently favors. But a pattern de hat begins to elongate along the fault trend. Events appearing progressively further southwest along the Hinagu system, or northeast Saint toward the Beppu Hanayama zone, is a different signal entirely. It means stress is migrating. It means the rupture may have loaded an adjacent segment rather than relieving it. And it means the probability window that JMA has defined does not merely persist, it intensifies. The Japan Meteorological Agency has warned residents in the worst affected areas to remain alert for a not her strong earthquake over the coming week, as well as the risk of landslides. That guidance is not bureaucratic caution. It is a direct reflection of what the 2016 sequence taught Japanese emergency management at a cost that cannot be overstated. The MHS, or Kumamoto earthquake 10 years ago, killed 275 people, injured 2,739, and damaged thousands of buildings, including the walls of the city's castle. The majority of that destruction did not occur in the first event. It accumulated across the sequence. Across S, the foreshock, the main shock that followed 28 hours later, and the hundreds of aftershocks that continued for weeks. Afterward. The second hit arrived on structures the first had already cracked. The third and fourth hits arrived on structures the second had further weakened. Cumulative seismic loading is a different kind of danger than a single large event, and it is the kind of danger that rewards patience and punishes the assumption that the worst is finished. Approximately 260,000 people have been advised to evacuate across Kyushu, with authorities also warning evacuees about the risk of heat stroke as temperatures in the region are expected to reach 34 degrees Celsius. That thermal reality adds a dimension to this emergency that seismic events and CEOlar seasons do not carry. People sheltering in evacuation centers, in vehicles, in parks, and open spaces, away from buildings that may not be safe to re-enter, those people are managing two simultaneous physical threats. The aftershock risk that keeps the M out of their homes, and the heat that makes the alternative dangerous. Emergency management in Japan is well practiced at both. But the intersection of the two, sustained over days, creates a humanitarian pressure that does not appear in any seismological mo. Rescue workers were continuing to search for people trapped beneath collapsed buildings, including the badly damaged Aeon Mall, as of Wednesday morning. The death toll confirmed by Prime Minister Takaichi stood at a minimum of 13, with that figure expected to rise as search operations continued and as the connection between the earthquake and various aftershock-related incidents was investigated. A chimney had collapsed at the Nippon Paper Industries factory in Yatsushiro, trapping workers beneath the debris. Multiple hospitals across the prefecture reported capacity pressure. The Fire and Disaster Management Agency confirmed that major public infrastructure had not suffered catastrophic systemic failure, but the localized damage pattern, concentrated in the Shindo 7 zone, reflects the kind of intensity distribution that leaves some streets passable and others completely impassable which is the scenario that makes rescue operations the most difficult and the most time-consuming. The broader industrial picture will sharpen over the coming days. TSMC, Sony, and Fujifilm have halted operations at regional facilities, and the timeline F, or resuming production, will depend on structural assessments that cannot be completed until the aftershock sequence has stabilized D sufficiently to allow engineers safe access to facilities. The semiconductor supply chain implications are not immediate. Production buffers exist precisely to absorb short-duration disruptions, but a shutdown measured in weeks rather than days begins to register in downstream manufacturing schedules. The automotive sector, which draws heavily on Kyushu-based component production, will be watching those timelines closely. What the global audience watching this story needs to understand, and what the competitor coverage often misses, is the distinction between the seismic noise of a normal day and the specific, documented fault, system-specific concern that is driving Japan's official posture right now. The Japan Meteorological Agency has officially named that as the 2026 Kumamoto earthquake, placing it formally in the national record alongside the 2016 sequence on the same fault structures. That naming is not ceremonial. It is an institutional act that encodes this event into the policy framework Japan uses to manage the weeks that follow. It means the elevated alert window is formally open. It means the aftershock monitoring protocol is FLE active. And it means the Prime Minister's guidance to prepare for another event of similar scale carries the full weight of the country's institutional seismic memory behind it. There is a discipline required in moments like this one. A disciplined bet. Wean what the numbers actually support and what a pattern feels like it suggests. The honest probability still favors yesterday being the main shock. The sequence is more likely than not to decay without producing a comparable event. That has been true of Eve Rai, large earthquake in this region's history, except one. But the one exception happened on this exact fault system, on this exact T-ground within living memory. And the people of Kumamoto know it. The Prime Minister knows it. The seismologists know it. And the institutional response of one of the most earthquake-prepared nations on Earth reflects that knowledge in every decision being made right now. Watch the aftershock map. Watch the 28-hour mark. Watch whether the spatial pattern stays compact or begins to migrate. Those are not arbitrary metrics. They are the specific diagnostics that will tell the scientific community why, and the people sheltering across Kyushu tonight, whether the ground beneath them has finished moving, or whether it is only pausing. Japan is still waiting. It has been waiting for roughly 30 hours. The window runs another 12 days.